Good day, everyone. I'm Lisa Gillette with the Investment Advisor Association. Welcome to our webinar, Recent Trends in SEC Exams. You'll be in listen-only mode during the webinar. You may submit questions at any time by typing them in the chat box. Questions will be addressed as time allows. As a reminder, this session is being recorded on May 25th, 2023. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to Sanjay Lamba, Associate General Counsel for the IAA. Sanjay?
Great. Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. And I'm actually going to introduce my fellow co-panelist. I'll start off with Mike Caccese, who's a partner at K&L Gates. I guess in addition to leading the investment management practice group, Mike is also the chairman of K&L Gates, the entire firm. So we're really pleased, Mike, to have you here. And you've spoken at a lot of our events, particularly on issues related to the marketing rule and IA issues. And so super excited to have you here. And joining Mike is his partner, Neil Smith at K&L Gates. Neil is the co-leader of their firm's investigation, enforcement, and white-collar practice. And so I know Neil works a lot with advisors on sort of helping them deal with investigations or enforcement matters, which is obviously a scary topic for many on this call, but we're pleased to have Neil here as well. And you both are based in the Boston office, so that's fantastic. And so I am, as Lisa pointed out, I'm on the legal team here at the IAA, and I'll be moderating today's call, and I'm just going to kind of walk through the agenda. So, you know, the SEC's examination priorities came out earlier this year, as they do every year. And I'm sure by now, many of you have had a chance to sort of read through and sort of identify which areas that the SEC will be focusing on. And so we're going to kind of go through this agenda. And as Lisa noted, it is, I think, would be really helpful if you ask questions by typing them in the chat box. I know Mike and Neil can go on and talk about a lot of these issues, but we really want to make this practical for you and give you some takeaways. And the way we can do that is answering your questions. So we do encourage you to ask them. I'll be monitoring the chat box and we'll take questions throughout. And if we have time, we'll address them at the end as well. So as you can see from this agenda, we'll start off by providing an overview of the 2023 examination priorities. As the SEC noted in the published priorities, what's new and notable here is a focus on the marketing rule, which is not a surprise. Their continued focus on fiduciary duty, private fund advisors, and a pretty significant focus on ESG. And then we'll talk about information security, operational resiliency. And then I put this bullet in here because it's a word that I guess the new administration, Chair Gensler, likes to use, which is emerging issues to protect working families, or in the words, retail investors. And here, there's been a huge focus on crypto assets and digital engagement practices, which is something that Chair Gensler has been talking a lot about lately. And then Neil and Mike will talk about what they're seeing during recent examinations, some topics, some trends that they're observing. And then they'll touch on the examination process and sort of where the exam program at the SEC is right now, and sort of how they're conducting exams, and how would be give some practical tips on how to respond to SEC examinations. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Mike now to give us an overview of the 2023 priorities.
Okay, Sanjay, thank you very much, and it's great being here. I'm going to quickly go through these priorities, and because a lot of these we're going to talk in detail throughout this presentation. And this is what the SEC has published: the custody, safekeeping, client assets. That's been on their list for a long time. And the only thing about that, I would say, in the examination process, questions are coming up which are under consideration on the new proposed custody rule. And it seems like the SEC is getting ahead of themselves, especially when it talks about custody of private securities. Valuation's always been a hot topic. It's becoming even more important right now, especially in the private equity world. the private fund world, where you have level 3 assets, where a lot of the asset values have gone down, and there's a lag time before firms are applying them. So there's a lot of emphasis on that, process procedures. Portfolio management, it's a classic, is a portfolio being managed in the way it's been described, in either the contract or the PPM? And if it hasn't been, why not? What were the breakdown of procedures, and was it disclosed? Brokerage and execution, this is the ongoing issue. Basically, best X. Are you receiving best X? Or are you buying and selling securities in the best interest of your clients? Conflicts of interest, that's everywhere. We're going to go throughout this presentation, talk about conflict of interest, calculation of fees and expenses. This is where the SEC is going to come in, and they're going to ask to see your work papers to see how you're calculating your fees. Is it consistent with what you disclosed, especially, again, in the private fund world where there's carry involved? Third-party service providers, we've got a peek of what the SEC is expecting in this area and their proposed rule for the oversight of third-party providers to investment advisors. And they're following some of those principles in the examination process. And the next one is whether advisors adopt to consider current market factors might affect valuation and accuracy of regulatory filings. And to give you the classic one, after SPV fail in the examination process, a classic question was coming up is, where's your disclosure in ADV about keeping your cash with banks that beyond the FDIC limit? So that's actually an issue as to where we have to be current and knowledgeable what's happening, make sure our documents are clear as to whatever the related risks are. And also, policy procedures, use of alternative data and compliance with, the code of ethics, how you treat in crypto, your access people that are trading crypto, how you handling those. So those really their priorities in general. So next slide, please.
Yeah, I guess, Mike, before we move on the point about reaching, talking about current market factors, I think we've been hearing that the exam staff is doing what they sort of call outreach calls. So when there's certain market events or certain issues that they see, they've been just reaching out to firms and sort of collecting information. And those probably would not be considered examinations, but it's sort of more making sure they understand what's going on. Is that?
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what happened in the SPV. I had several clients got a call from the staff saying, we're looking at your ADV. And these were well-known firms that had most likely had loans out of SPV. They also had to keep their cash in SPV. And they wanted to know, did they disclose to their clients the risks of not having that FDIC insured and the risk not be able to get that cash out? So that's exactly what happened there.
Yeah, I'll turn the chain. Okay, so Mike, before you, I guess you're going to talk about the marketing rule, but I just wanted to give a quick update on some information that we learned very recently, in fact, yesterday, about where the SEC is on their examinations of the new marketing rule 2064-1, which I'm sure many folks in this call have been grappling with. Certainly the rule came into effect November last year, and folks are still working through implementation issues. I know Mike will talk about that. But where the SEC exam staff is, of course, they published a risk alert late last year before the compliance date, indicating that they will be doing examinations. And so what we've learned is that they've started their marketing rule initiative exams right after compliance date. Phase 1 is what they refer to as their marketing rule overlay exams. And here really what the exam staff did is they reached out to firms. I think they over 500 firms that were being examined or planned to be examined. And as part of that ongoing examination, they were asking overlay questions regarding the marketing rule. And basically they were asking firms, a series of questions about where they are on the marketing rule, trying to get a sense of how much the firm understood the marketing rule and its implications to its firm. And our understanding is that those exams were completed on April 30th. And as I said, they did over 500 of those. And based on their observations from those examinations, we understand that the SEC is going to publish a risk alert. So this will be their second risk alert under the marketing rule. And on this one, they'll share some initial observations. Now, we also understand that they completed on March 31st, phase 2A, this is what they refer to of their marketing initiative. And here they looked at firms' ADV filings, your policies and procedures. They were really focused a lot on a new requirement under the marketing rule that firms be able to substantiate material statements of fact. And I know Mike and Neil, you'll talk about what that means. And as I said, those exams were completed on March 31st. Then they started their phase 2B and 2C marketing rule exams that covered performance-related issues and record keeping. Those were completed in mid-May, and on May 11th, they started phase 3 of their examinations, and here they will be looking at testimonials and endorsements, third-party ratings, your general prohibitions, again, the substantiation requirement as a continued focus. They'll be looking at your disclosures. And our understanding is that they hope to have those exams completed either by the end of the year or March of 2024. And so, clearly they are focused a lot on the marketing rule. They're out there doing examinations. And I think just one additional matter, I think we've heard that there have been some cases that have been referred to enforcement, although it's our understanding that those cases dealt with issues that probably would have been enforcement actions under the old advertising rule, but because they're so focused on marketing that they were able to identify some serious issues. Unclear to us as to whether any of those enforcement actions specifically involve the new marketing rule, but clearly a focus of the examination program. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you and to maybe react to that or give your thoughts on where we are in the marketing rule.
Sure. I mean, when the marketing rule came out, we all expected the SEC to immediately do a big sweep. They didn't do that, but what they did do is exactly what Sanjay said. As part of their examination requests of advisors, they would add several, actually 4 or 5 consistent questions covering some of the areas Sanjay focused on, where they were collecting a lot of the information. And as a result of that, we're starting to get a feel for where the SEC's views are on some of the unclear areas of the marketing rule. I'll talk to you about some of those. But they also have told us that the examination process, unless it's a clear violation, it's not to get the advisor in trouble. It's really to use it for the staff to learn how the advisors dealt with the marketing rule, dealt with some of the uncertainties under the marketing rule, and also how they have done it in addressing their policies and procedures. So I think overall, the examination process, at least from clients that I've been involved with, it's a learning experience basically from both sides. And I think when they come out with the risk alert, that's where we're really going to get, hopefully, clarity on some of the difficult areas. And, just, a few practice points of this. Make sure your policies, procedures are consistent with what you're doing. Make sure all your marketing materials from your DDQs, RFPs, and slide decks, websites, again, are also consistent with what the marketing rule requires and your own policy and procedures. And I'll give you an example. Go on a bunch of advisors' websites, and you will still see hypothetical performance in certain areas. And that's an issue that may not be appropriate, because of hypothetical performance, you have to have some type of knowledge of the category of clients you're marketing to, that they're sophisticated and knowledgeable enough and consume the risk and understand the risk of hypothetical performance. And it's pretty hard to justify that on a website. So you got to make sure, all ends of the rules are being complied with. Next slide, please. Okay. We've had 3 FAQs, and I'll just quickly go through this. First one was the questions: you have to keep your performance updated as of year end. The FAQ asked the question, well, how far after the year end? And they said a month. But that is really, I get this question a lot. Well, I'm a fund of funds manager, I have private investments, going to take me more time than a month to evaluate my NAV of those funds and calculate the performance. The rule doesn't say you have to do it. You have to do reasonable efforts at the end of the month. And so you do have flexibility on that. Gross and net directive on displaying gross and net performance. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. And there are challenges, and that raises the challenges addressing net performance in areas not addressed by the SEC. We have to think about this in this rule. The SEC has never defined what performance is, but we know from staff comments, their definition of performance is that if the statistic you're using can be converted into a dollar, in their view, that would be considered performance. And I'll talk about that again in the next file. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. Next slide. Okay. All right. Well, let me go a little more detail on this one. Let's talk about a couple things that really have come up. One is we have the FAQ, and this is the FAQ that came out, much to everybody's surprise, because it came out just a few months after the rule in effect and after everybody was trying to comply with the rule without clear direction and some of the gray areas from the SEC staff. And so the FAQ basically said that if you're showing performance of a single security, you're going to have to show that performance on a net basis because they consider that extractive performance. Even though it was talked about in a private fund situation, the principles are applicable to all type of situations, not when you're just presenting private fund performance. And subsequent to that, there were some statements by the staff, including some statements at the IAA compliance conference in the spring, where they made it very clear that they gave us the definition of performance, anything that can convert it into a dollar, and also that you always have to show it net. You can show net and gross in close proximity with equal prominence, but you had to show it net. And so it really caused the industry, well, how do we handle this? And this is where what I've been telling people, where a lot of firms are doing, because there's all different types of measurements of performance. So I've been telling firms, and a lot of firms have been doing, is just categorize how you present performance-related numbers. There are those numbers that can be converted to a dollar, such as your general performance numbers itself. If you're showing a return on an individual security or portfolio holding, portfolio company, that's a dollar value. And then you have risk measurements. And it's clear, the staff has made it clear that a risk measurement, such as a Sharpe ratio number or a trainer number, is risk related, and that is not performance. And that was made clear at the CFA GIPS conference at late last year. And then you have these whole categories in the middle. And so suggestion is for firms to categorize what I would call the gray areas, and see if the gray areas, if any of them can be readily changed to a dollar number, then treat it as performance. But there are some that could be that make no sense, such as yield to maturity. Yield to maturity could be considered a performance number of the return on a portfolio. But if you're telling the yield to maturity of a bond in the portfolio, That's not performance of the portfolio. The individual will never earn that performance. And so what we're seeing people doing in those situations, that those gray categories, make it clear you're talking about the individual investment or the contribution to the overall portfolio, but make sure you include the actual net of fee performance of the compositor or portfolio that yield to maturity comes out. It's a reasonable approach, and I'm sure we'll get some clarity about this in the risk alert when it comes up.
Mike, I'm just going to maybe, and I was, thank you for mentioning the IAA conference. So I happen to be on that panel with the SEC person. And I think a couple of additional things that I wanted to sort of share is that, and I think you alluded to this, that they made absolutely clear that even if you are showing total gross and total net, and then you want to show a table of all of the underlying investments, and you want to show those gross on a gross basis, that each one of those have to be shown net. So even if you're showing everything, of course, that sort of runs contrary to what the word extracted performance means, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that is a clarification. And I also wanted to sort of share a conversation that I've had with the SEC staff, where they've noticed that firms have been, in some instances, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see this in the risk alert, referring to the model fee that they have to come up with, right? In some cases, to show this net performance as a hypothetical fee. And according to the staff, that's not what they want to see, because to them that sort of mitigates the importance or the reality of that number. And so if you use the word hypothetical, which by the way sort of conflates it with another part of the definition, something in the also in the marketing rule, which talks about hypothetical performance, that they do not want to see this number referred to as a made up number or a hypothetical number. But of course, you can disclose the assumptions that were made, and you should actually are required to disclose that. And the other issue that they're concerned about is any reference to a require that if you try to disclose that, hey, we're showing you this number because we're required to under SEC rules. And again, according to the SEC staff that I spoke to, that's not acceptable either. I don't know if you have a reaction to that or not, but I just wanted to sort of share that as well.
Yeah, I think that they are, whether agree or not, they're the views of the staff, and I think they say a lot about the performance. Stating that you're showing this because the SEC requires it. My reaction is that I don't see that as an issue. The staff obviously does. It doesn't mean it's endorsed. We're not permitted to say the performance has been endorsed by the SEC. That's not an endorsement. But I think it's always better, instead of saying we're forced to show this, we're showing this for the reason that we're showing the effect of a net fee can have on a performance calculations. Like we used to say before, that when you show gross of performance in a one-on-one presentation, you always had to put the disclosure, the effect, if you attach the fee, the compounding effect of the overall performance. I think that's really the better approach to do it. I also, in this area, at that conference, they made it clear there's no grace period related to the FAQ, but it's really hard to turn, especially if you're in the middle of a marketing plan. It's really basically hard to turn the aircraft carrier around. When you printed everything up, you have all your material ready to go, you send it out through whatever electronic communications. So what I've seen firms do, and I think it's a reasonable approach, is when the SEC comes in, they're questioning you why you're showing this still on a gross basis after the FAQ is issued. As long as you have reasonable steps being taken to not continue showing it, such as, when you calculate maybe your first quarter performance of this year, you want to then show that on a net basis consistent. It's really the good faith effort of complying with a FAQ that nobody was expecting at all. So I think that's what's really important for the exam process.
Yeah, I agree, and I have seen copies of deficiency letter language where they've actually cited firms for not complying with what was contemplated in the FAQ that came out after the compliance date. So really unfortunate. Okay, so let's turn over to talking about the fiduciary duty and I guess Form CRS. I know we spent a lot of time on the marketing rule, but obviously that's a very significant area. But Mike, or are you going to address this as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to address this too. This is fiduciary form CRS. This, fiduciary duty has always been a big issue in the advisory and examination process, but it really has taken on a heightened review by the examination staff coming out of Reg BI. And they are focused on key areas on this, whereby they want to make sure that the advisor has adequate information about the potential client that they're giving advice to, that the advice and recommendations are consistent with basically the investment goals, the knowledge, et cetera, of the client. Now, what I would recommend people to do is that the SEC a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, came out with their third interpretation of fiduciary duty. And this is in relationship to Reg BI and the Q&As they came out with. And in those, they talk seriously in a lot of depth about the duty of care or that an advisor has and a broker-dealer has to their end users. And they really went through in a lot of detail, and I think they really went beyond what typically the industry follows. And they walked through a couple of things, and I think it's really worthwhile for everybody to take a review of that and see where the SEC staff's focus is on. And I'll go through a couple here. They really believe that an advisor needs to consider when making recommendations, what are fees and expenses for effective return? That includes whether it's an index fund or a non-index fund. Are there account setup fees? Are there separate fees that the advisor should take all those considerations before they make a recommendation? It's not whether just the security or the recommendation is appropriate. It's all the underlying expenses that the client will have to incur for that investment. They also talk about you have to take, if it's a taxable investor, you have to take tax costs in concern. And that would also mean, tax harvesting. Does it mean you have to do tax harvesting? No, but you have to consider the tax costs when you're going to sell a security, and which security you're going to sell, make a recommendation for. And also, which really, I think, went really far, is that they said that many FAs, many advisors out there will have approved list of securities or funds they're going to recommend. They've been pre-approved, they've done their due diligence on them. And the SEC made it clear that using a limited menu of permissible investments when making a recommendation is not in and of itself appropriate. It's not suitable. That the advisor has to look beyond other possible investments that may be appropriate. And that's a big expansion, and it's going to be a big effect on a lot of advisors, especially a lot of financial advisors that just follow a limited menu list. And they also go through a lot of detail about what information does the advisor have to collect on the individual client. And they go through a whole list. And actually, it's a very helpful list of what you need to do in determining the client's investment objectives, their tax statuses, the goals, et cetera. There's like 15 different items you should consider, and you need to collect that information. And the final thing they talk about is really disclosure of the conflict of interests. Not much new here. That's always a huge issue, but you have to be aware of those conflicts, and you're going to have to clearly disclose them. And the last thing I want to say on this is that what are they going to do in the examination site? They're going to look for documentation that supports all these elements. And when you're making a recommendation, when you have all the information on a particular client, how are you applying that? So this is really a record-keeping, documentation, substantiation approach that the examiners are going to take and have been taking in the examination process.
And I'll mention it's interesting, of course, this bulletin came out from the staff in the Division of Investment Management, right, that does the rulemaking. And they have actually a team there that works with trading markets on sort of Reg BI and duty of care. But we've been hearing the exam staff refer to this bulletin, right? And so clearly, as you pointed out, this will be something that the exam staff will be looking at. Hey, Mike, I got a question to you regarding the tax status. To me, something that jumped out is, you not only have to sort of be aware of, say, the tax bracket that a client is, but sort of the tax consequences relative to that. Is that new, or is that what firms have already? I guess I'm trying to understand.
I think, well, that's the first time I've seen it in coming out from the staff as a factor to consider, because many advisors are tax neutral when they make the recommendations. But I think that's really the tax status gets more, I think, into, the protecting the family assets, as Gensler calls it, because with the new emphasis on tax harvesting, especially since we've had significant losses in portfolios, I look at this as you can't ignore it, but you're going to have to consider it, and you're going to have to make a determination why you sold security A when you could have sold security B, and then may have had a tax loss that you used to offset future gains. So that's why I look at that. So it's really a retail investor approach.
Yeah, and you got to document that.
Yes, you do.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Should we move on?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So private fund advisors. Yeah.
Yeah. Private fund advisors. This is an SEC issue that they've been focused on for a long time. And these are the areas I think we've seen examinations. If you're having highly leveraged private funds, very similar to where they view as highly leveraged ETFs, you have to have clear disclosure. A lot of it's a suitability analysis, especially in the retail world. Does the investor understand, or your client clearly understand, the risks of the leverage within the strategy? Is it described appropriately in the PPM? And also what effects it has on the performance, because it can significantly inflate your performance. So that's what they're really focusing on. The side-by-side management with BDCs, that's really important. A lot of the BDCs, if it's, BDC is registered, a lot of them have exemptions. Really where the focus here is that the BDC is operating under an exemption where you can do side-by-side management by the advisor. Are you complying with the terms of the exemption? Use of affiliated companies, advisory personnel, such as in the private equity world, you may have an affiliated company that does supply certain services. It's very interesting. They're asking firms now to justify why that is the appropriate entity to supply their services, as opposed to other people, commercial entities that can supply them on a cheaper basis. And why was that decision made? Hard to value investments, and we'll talk about that later. This is really a valuation issue. If they've gone down in value, why is there a lag? Especially if you have similar investments in your other funds, maybe in your liquid funds or your mutual funds or in your separate accounts. Why are you delaying the valuation of those investments in your private funds? SPACs, that's an ongoing issue. If you have SPACs, this really gets down to a lot of disclosures related to the SPACs. Is that SPAC really following through on what it said it was going to invest and when it was going to invest? And the final one, which I'm seeing more of a focus on, is advisor-led restructuring, stapled secondary transaction continuation funds. The SEC looks at these transactions very highly suspicious, benefiting the advisor, not to the benefit of the client. So if you're engaging in any of these transactions, what I would recommend you do is, for example, if you have a continuation fund and you're going to continue your fund for 2 or 3 years because you don't want to sell out holdings you have at a deep discount, how are you going to justify that that's appropriate? Is that what the investor bought into, where they're going to be locked up for another 2 or 3 years? This is really a justification type of approach, or records you have that support that.
Mike, before we move on, we did get a question going back to the duty of care bulletin, and it's actually a good clarification. So the bulletin applies, I think, right to retail when you're dealing with retail clients. But as this question points out, the retail approach regarding Reg BI is also applicable to non-retail, or so how does this bulletin sort of apply in the Reg BI context?
Well, the bulletin, even though it talks about Form CRS and Reg BI in it, it talks about in general terms of the fiduciary duty of advisor. While the Reg BI talks about two-legged people, what I've read that guidance as really a continuation of the past two interpreted guidance that's come out from the SEC on fiduciary duties.
Yeah.
So I think the principles there are apply whoever your client is.
But I think it's still fair to say, though, from the SEC's perspective, right? They think differently when you're dealing with retail investors.
Yes.
Yeah. And so
Yes.
I think, yeah, okay. But that's a good.
I agree with that.
Okay.
Okay.
And I do want to remind folks to ask questions and just type them into the chat box. I know Mike's doing a fantastic job of preempting and answering all your questions, but if you have them. ESG, sort of our focus of this.
Yeah.
Okay, Neil, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So obviously ESG remains a focus for the SEC, both in all aspects, but including on the exam side, and we'll be an exam focus this year. You know, the key criteria, as we all know, is that our funds operating in a manner that's consistent with what they're disclosing. Or if you say you have a carbon neutral fund, is that true? If you say you have an ESG focused fund, is that true? Can you support that? They want to eliminate having these disclosures that are not supported by the investments in the fund. So are these products appropriately labeled? And if they're not, then they're potentially misleading. And also, tacking on at the end here, are these recommendations also in investors' best interests? This is only increased in the last couple of years, and we expect this year will remain a focus. But starting with different sweep examinations last year and also some enforcement actions last year, we expect more of those will come as well. And again, the critical difference that we've seen from a deficiency to an enforcement action is partly intent. Are you deliberately mislabeling a fund? Are you deliberately trying to sell something as ESG friendly, as carbon neutral, but it's really stocked with a whole bunch of coal investments, and you're doing it to mislead folks? That's going to pretty quickly get you referred to enforcement. But on the exam side, you still need to say, well, what if you do have an ESG fund, how are you considering those principles? What's the process? Are you following it? Are you disclosing the process? And if you have exemptions, let's say you can invest in a tobacco, you can invest in a coal plant if it passes certain criteria, if it's approved in certain ways, is that being disclosed as well? Those are all the types of things that we've seen them asking and expect they will continue to ask in an ESG focused exam. If you go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, sorry, one back, Sanjay.
All right.
There we go. So, we expect document requests, and many of you have probably seen this, but looking to review all ESG disclosures and substantiating the claims, much like trading, much like your customer info and your Reg BI info. Substantiation is key on an exam. We expect there to be interviews of PMs and ESG responsible persons. If your firm has an appointed ESG person, the lead head of ESG, okay, what does that mean? Does that person have actual authority? Is that person involved in investment decision makings? How is that person, or how is the firm rating different ESG investments? What's the process that's being done? How are these things being scored? And how are you documenting it so that the SEC can look at it and say, yes, you followed your disclosure, yes, you followed your guidelines, or no, you didn't. If you say that you support the Paris Agreement, but you don't do anything to support that, it's just sort of a marketing statement, that could be an issue. That could be misleading. They're going to want specific steps being taken to actually follow those things, to actually, show that beyond stating, we stand with this, but actually doing it. And again, if you have certain investments in an ESG focused fund that don't meet the investment criteria, that don't meet the ESG criteria, how do those end up in there? Why are they still in that fund? What process was gone through to get them in there? And was it fully disclosed? Again, I think what we're seeing is referral to enforcement for these matters is very low. The SEC wants to make some statements here, and they want to make people aware, and they're looking to change behavior. I think recently the SEC, as many of you know, they started a climate and ESG task force run by the Deputy Director of Enforcement, Sanjay Wada, which, they don't staff these task force for no reason. They do them to bring cases, to send messages. And we expect that cases will come out of that. One other thing to note on this, some of you may have seen, there are inquiries from a number of state attorney generals regarding different ESG investments and disclosures, which may be coming at it from a different angle. Are clients being put into ESG investments also consistent with fiduciary duty, or is it being done for political or other purposes? So some of you may have seen this, but there are a number of states where their attorney generals are starting that inquiry, and we expect that could build into something bigger down the line as well.
Neil, let me just add one thing to that, which I've seen the SEC examination staff focus on. If you're a global asset manager and you're doing managing funds products in the EU, and you're making SFDR representations. I have seen the staff say, well, explain what you're, assuming substantially similar strategy that you hold managing the US versus in the EU, they have asked managers to justify why they're making certain statements or representing certain level of SFDR compliance, while they're not doing the same in the US. So if you do that, because those requirements are not consistent, you make sure you have it justified why the difference is there, because it's a hot item right now.
Yeah, great point. Next slide. So another exam focus has been information security and operational resiliency. This is it's a policy focus exam issue. We think they're looking at firm policies. They want to know what you're saying, but also they want to make sure you're supporting it. You have a policy, but you also have the tools in place to prevent and respond to any cyber-related threats, right? Things they're talking about and that they're looking for, tone from the top, implementation and enforcement of these rules. It's not just a paper policy, but it's something that's actually being implemented, and there are consequences if there are folks that violate those policies within the organization. And then risk assessments. A lot of this is going to be risk-based, depending on what your footprint is and different cyber interactions that your firm has. You need to have a tailored policy that's good, that is aimed at preventing the risks that you face and that your clients face. So, again, we live in a world where those risks are elevated right now. And lots of firms are coming under attack, and they're getting more sophisticated. The SEC is attuned to that and are taking steps through exams to try to make sure that advisors are also working on that. We expect this is a significant enforcement area. The SEC is focused on it as a significant enforcement area. They've said a few things that they care about. Mobile security is one, data loss prevention is another. Incident response and resiliency is a third. And how do you respond to these things? How quickly and how strongly? Vendor management. If you're working with third-party vendors in different areas, how are you making sure that they also have the same levels of protection? And training is obviously a key in making sure people are actually following these policies. The policy is no good if no one is following. Can you go to the next slide, please, Sanjay? And so I think, what we've seen and what the SEC has said is they're focusing on these policies. Customer information is obviously sacrosanct, and they want to make sure that is the main thing being protected. Practices to prevent interruption of mission critical services. What happens if there's a hack? What happens if ransomware? What happens if there's sophisticated cyber intrusion? What is your plan to deal with that? They're going to want to see that, and they're going to want to see if you had any incidents, how did you respond to them during the exam period? Compliance with rules, SP and SID. So, adopting written policies to protect customer information, and then the identity theft red flags rule, SID, are two things that we expect exam will focus on as well this year. Are you doing the risk assessment, and how are you making sure that covered accounts are being protected here? They've proposed a rule recently to enhance Reg SP to actually provide notice of data breaches, and so that we'll be watching that to see how that impacts. But I do think, again, in this as a focus area here for exam, if you had an incident, if you had a data breach, potential data breach, they're going to want to see what you did, how you responded to it. Did you notify people that needed to be notified of it? What steps did you take to make sure it didn't happen again?
And you alluded to the proposals. Yes, I mean, they have obviously the SP, and they also have cyber, proposals for broker dealers and investment advisors and a whole slew of other registrants. So although those are proposals, I would encourage folks to read them, because I think a lot of discussion that's in there by the commission really talks a lot about the concerns that they have and sort of the expectations that they have, even if they don't really come out with, which they will come out with final rules. But I think it's important to read those because it sort of sets the bar of what the staff is expecting. Okay. All right. Emerging technologies and crypto assets.
All right, I'll take the lead on this, and Neil jump in. Crypto assets, as we all know, it is a hot item for the SEC, and they believe there's a lot of abuse in this area. So I think there's a couple areas to consider. Probably, I would say, an abundance of caution. If you're investing your client's money into crypto assets, assume that it's a security. While there's many arguments could not be security, we are seeing the SEC basically, even through enforcement actions and through litigation, they're taking the view that almost all crypto assets are securities. So treat them as securities. I think a defense that they're not securities will be hard won. And you're probably not going to win that argument, at least with examination staff. You may win it if it goes over to enforcement. Now, so what does that mean? What type of procedures you have to have in place? I think it's important when you're making those recommendations, you really have to understand about the assets. You're going to have to understand how's it custodied, how is it valued, how is it liquid, what liquidity there is there. And also what's the volatility of the market. Those are all the factors I think you're going to have to consider and document when you're making a recommendation to a client to invest in crypto. Or even for your non-discretionary advisor, make sure the client is aware of the related risks. And this goes into updating your policies, procedures, basically your investment process, investment overview to address those issues. And then I want to get to the last bullet here, robo-advisors. The SEC has been doing what I call a mini sweep on robo-advisors. And where they're focusing on is suitability. Then I'll refer you to the Reg BI Q&A. Or is the advisor receiving the required information to make sure the advice that the robo-advisor is issuing considers all the related factors for the particular client? The second thing, is the system appropriately tested? Sort of like probably was a decade ago, where quant managers were under the microscope of the SEC because they weren't testing the accuracy of their models. And if they were updating them, they weren't correcting the errors or going to clients, make them whole from the errors that are created. So you're going to have to test the robo-advisor, test the modeling to make sure it's accurate, and obviously keep records of any changes. And you're also, again, going to have a general oversight to make sure that the model is consistent with the particular investor that you're using the model for.
Mike, in the interest of time, I'm also, there's digital engagement practices, but what I'm going to just maybe skip this, but what I'm going to say is that, I think the SEC is sort of going beyond just robo advice now, and they're looking at digital engagement practices more broadly. And I think now with this artificial intelligence chat stuff that's going on out there, I think this is certainly an area that we should look out for. In fact, we're expecting a rulemaking on digital engagement practices, so stay tuned on that. But in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to some of the recent topics and trends that you're seeing.
Okay, Neil, you want to take this?
Yeah. So ephemeral messaging, I'm sure all of us know what that is, and the SEC's focus on that, and we've seen the recent actions. But the record retention requirements of the Advisors Act Rule 2042 apply. They're broadly read. It's a broadly defined term, and if it's never a good idea to try to navigate whether it is or is not a business communication. I think that if it's business related, client related, client discussions, the SEC is going to take the initial tact that is business related and needs to be preserved per the rule. It doesn't matter what the medium is. Preservation is important, and I think what funds can do to be prepared for exams is, number one, make sure you have the right policies in place. You have the right supervision of personnel to make sure that's being monitored, both electronically, but also through policies and training and things like that. And that there's a detection and prevention beyond self-reporting that you're looking at as well, and that you're enforcing these things, that there are consequences for folks that might that violate those things. Best practices here is, as Sanjay has put up, routine trainings, both technical measures to preserve these things, but also risk assessments of what your people are doing and how they're communicating. Making sure that you're on top of that, and making sure that employees understand the consequences as well, both for them and for the firm. And that could include discipline if there's a violation that's detected. And the SEC is going to want to know, and they're going to ask, have there been violations of your messaging, policies? If so, what did you do? How did you respond to that? How did you detect it? What did you do? Did you retrain? Did you, impose a fine, et cetera, et cetera?
And you provided us some examples of some enforcement actions, and obviously this is a case where a situation where enforcement is definitely interested in this area as well. So why don't we move on to some worrying trends that you're seeing, Mike, and out in examinations.
Yeah, and I'll take the first one. So,
Okay.
We've seen recently that advisors are being asked to sign a letter where they, instruct their outside auditor to voluntarily provide work papers for that fund. That is obviously pretty beyond a normal examination. It's consistent with steps we've seen the SEC take in recent years, where they sort of go beyond, what they typically have done. They reach out to former employees. They ask for contact information for people that have left, especially compliance people or people that had other issues or concern. They don't have subpoena authority. Exam does not have subpoena authority, so these things are on a voluntary basis. But it is an expansion of what's normally done, and in an exam, or historically done in an exam, and very aggressive. And our advice generally when those issues come up is you should seek counsel. You should seek outside counsel or internal counsel to understand the parameters of what they're asking and what you should do and how you should respond.
Yeah, I would also, what we're also seeing here is that the exam staff, if an issue comes up, and we've seen this in the marketing role, if the exam staff will sometimes pick up the phone and they're going to call the compliance person and see what are they doing, what have they done related to the marketing role, how they implement the policies, what are some of the challenges. So it's very interesting that they're actually calling up the internal compliance people to get information. They're just not showing up at the door. There also have been situations where they are showing up without giving advance notice. Well, usually they send you the request 2 weeks, whatever, beforehand, so you're prepared. We've had one or two situations where they're showing up and delivering that information. And these are not situations that we're aware of anyway, where there's ongoing fraud. I think investors are at immediate danger of harm there. So that's a new trend. examination initiated by the Division of Enforcement. Several of our clients have gotten examination letters from the Division of Enforcement, and I can tell you that really gets a client's attention when it comes to enforcement. And that's and usually it's focused. It's part of a mini sweep. They will be doing that. They did one probably around a year ago related to ETFs, revenue sharing. Was one in particular they did focus on. And we just had, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, Director of Enforcement announced they're going to focus on private funds. It's a priority, and they're going to deal with what we talked about earlier, conflicts of interest, fees, expense issues, and disclosures. Again, that's not examination, that's a Division of Enforcement. So I think it's interesting, and maybe Neil can add a little more to this, is why enforcement is taking a proactive role here instead of waiting for referrals coming from examination.
Well, I think it's consistent with everything that Gensler and Gerbier have been saying about being aggressive and about aggressively policing the market and aggressively dealing with certain issues that they think are unfair to customers. So it remains and will remain a very aggressive SEC, and exam is not immune to that. They're usually it's enforcement that you have to worry about. But the exam folks are involved here as well.
Well,
yeah.
Shoot, I don't want to end on that scary note. That's but everyone should have me dial. So let's go back to exams. Let's stop talking about horse.
Sorry.
No. It's important information. Okay, so the exam process. I think Mike, you and I were talking. It seems like things have really changed on how they're conducting exams. You want to talk about some of the recent stuff that you've been seeing out of the exam group?
Sure. Some of the recent things is, first of all, they're showing up now in person after almost a 3-year gap. They're showing up in person. Usually, the time they're spending in house is not as long as it was in the past, and they're doing a lot of work out of their office or homes. That's one thing. The second thing, the quality, what I'm hearing and seeing is the quality of the exam staff is not as high as it was pre-COVID. A part of that is because they have a lot of new exam staff and they're learning and they're being training. They're not as familiar with the new strategies out there, they're not familiar with the new products. So you have to be patient with them. And they may go down the wrong rabbit hole, and you have to try to pull them back. And I think in the process itself, what we tell people, if they give you a deadline, you always can ask for more. If the requests are overbearing, you can always try to eliminate it. And production of documents, they almost always will agree to give you documents to them on a rolling basis. That's really important, especially if you're a small shop and you don't have the staff to do it. They're still requesting email reviews. And also what we tell people, don't always roll over, don't always agree with them. They're wrong. And many of them just trying to do the right thing, the right job, but they don't know your business or strategies as much as you do. You probably can add to that.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that when you're disputing what they're saying, or if they're disputing a certain position that they appear to be taking pre-deficiency, you want to do that in writing. You want to think it through and make sure that you're putting your best argument out there. And the last thing I'll say, I know we're pushed for time, but is don't treat the interviews as a normal meeting. Don't treat them as a friendly chat. You need to prepare for them. You need to treat them like what they are, which is an interview with the government enforcement examination, but a sort of a law enforcement agency. And you need to remember what their goal is. Their goal is to find a deficiency, and 90% of their exams, they find deficiencies. That's their goal. Their goal is not to understand your business or be your pal or tell you what a great job you're doing. Their job there is to find deficiencies, and you need to treat the interviews in that light and understand that that's why they're there.
But to give people comfort, I think very, very few percentage-wise gets referred to enforcement, right?
Correct.
Okay, all right.
Find deficiencies is different than refer to enforcement.
Yes,
That is true.
yes. Well, you guys are fantastic. I thought there's obviously a lot of issues that we can keep talking about, but I think we hit some of the high points of where the SEC exam staff is. And so before we finish up, I just wanted to point out that if you have questions, I included a link to their bios, Mike and Neil's bios, as well as their contact information. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you.
Mhm.
And obviously, we have a lot of resources that relate to a lot of the topics that are covered by the exam program. We have our resource library for IAA members. We have our marketing, dedicated pages on the marketing rule. And of course, we have our marketing implementation group. And these are all it's just some of the legal compliance, some of the committees and working groups that we have that I encourage IAA members to join to get more information on these issues. And of course, you always have access to me or anyone else on the legal team if you have any questions. I also want to remind everyone that we have our Advocacy Day coming up here June 7th and June 8th. Neil and Mike, I want to formally invite you guys if you want to think about it. But, this is a great day that folks can spend on the Hill, and we arrange a whole bunch of meetings for people to go and talk to their local their congressmen or their reps. And we have some great speakers, so I encourage folks to think about that. And then we obviously will have our regional compliance roundtables that we're doing around the country. I'll be in San Francisco and LA, so anyone who wants to meet me out there, these are great events, and of course we'll do a deep dive into a lot of these issues that Mike and Neil touched on. And so with that said, Neil, Mike, I want to thank you guys so much for agreeing to do this. We really appreciate your time, and thank you again so much. And Al Gates, who's an associate member and a great partner of the IA on a lot of these issues, and we really value that as well. So thank you guys.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, and talk to you soon. Bye.